The autumn wind whistled across the vast Montana plains, carrying with it the scent of pine and promise as the sun dipped below the jagged mountain peaks. Eleanor Montgomery stood on the weathered porch of her family's century-old ranch house, her calloused hands gripping the railing, watching shadows stretch like memories across the land that had sustained generations of her family. At 42, Eleanor possessed the kind of quiet strength that commanded respect without demanding attention, her weathered face telling stories of harsh winters and unforgiving summers, of battles won and lost against the elements that threatened to consume the life she had built from dust and determination. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Double M Ranch had been Eleanor's salvation and her prison, the place where she had retreated after her husband's sudden death 10 years earlier left her with 300 acres, a mountain of debt, and a reputation as the most private rancher in Clearwater County. The locals respected her space, admired her grit, but few had penetrated the careful walls she had constructed around her heart and her home. Inside the ranch house, the ancient grandfather clock chimed 6 times, pulling Eleanor from her thoughts, and reminding her that chores waited for no one, not even those lost in contemplation of what might have been. She turned, her boots creaking against the wooden planks as she made her way back inside, pausing only briefly to remove her worn Stetson before entering the warm kitchen that had always been the heart of the Montgomery home. The sight that greeted her stopped Eleanor cold. Maria Diaz, the quiet woman who had worked as the ranch's housekeeper for the past 3 years, was gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, her face contorted in pain as she attempted to move toward the sink. Her right leg was bent at an awkward angle, and even from across the room, Eleanor could see the swelling around her ankle, the unnatural coloration that spoke of serious injury. "Maria?" Eleanor's voice broke the silence, startling the younger woman, who immediately tried to straighten, to hide her obvious distress. "It's nothing, Miss Montgomery," Maria insisted, her accent thickening with pain as she attempted to put weight on her injured leg, only to wince visibly. "I just slipped while mopping. I'll be fine in a minute." But Eleanor had spent a lifetime around injuries, broken bones from bucking horses, sprains from cattle drives, wounds that needed tending when town was too far and help too expensive. She crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, her trained eye assessing the damage even as Maria tried to wave away her concern. "Sit down," Eleanor commanded, not unkindly but with the firm tone that brooked no argument. "That's not nothing. Let me see." Maria reluctantly allowed herself to be guided to a chair, her reluctance speaking volumes about a woman accustomed to suffering in silence rather than asking for help. Eleanor knelt beside her, gently removing the practical shoe and rolling down the sock to reveal an ankle already swollen to twice its normal size, mottled with angry purple bruising. "How long has this been bothering you?" Eleanor asked, carefully probing the injury and noting Maria's sharp intake of breath, even at the gentlest touch. Maria's eyes remained fixed on the floor, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "A few weeks," she admitted finally, "but it wasn't this bad before. I need this job, Miss Montgomery. My children. Your children need their mother whole and healthy." Eleanor interrupted, rising to her feet with decision. "This needs a doctor, Maria. I'm taking you to town." The panic that flashed across Maria's face was immediate and unmistakable. No doctors, please. I don't have papers. I don't have insurance. They will ask questions and then—" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor had suspected Maria's undocumented status. It wasn't uncommon in this part of Montana, where ranch work and a willingness to accept cash payments often created a silent agreement between employer and employee. But she had never asked, had respected the younger woman's privacy, just as she guarded her own. Eleanor crossed to the freezer, removing an ice pack she kept for her own aches and pains. "Put this on it while I make a call," she said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "We're getting you help, Maria, one way or another." In her office, Eleanor dialed a number from memory, one she hadn't used in years but had never forgotten. Dr. Thomas Walker had been her husband's best friend, had delivered all three of the children Eleanor had buried alongside their father. After the car accident that had shattered her world, he had tried to maintain their friendship after the funerals, but Eleanor had pushed him away along with everyone else, unable to bear the sympathy in his eyes or the memories his presence evoked. "Tommy," she said when he answered, her voice softer than it had been in the kitchen, "I need a favor and discretion." 30 minutes later, Dr. Walker's faded blue pickup bumped down the long driveway to the ranch house, dust billowing behind it like a signal flag announcing his arrival. Eleanor watched from the porch, tension visible in the set of her shoulders, in the way her fingers unconsciously twisted the wedding band she still wore after all these years. Thomas Walker emerged from the truck looking much as Eleanor remembered, tall and lanky with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried his medical bag with the same casual confidence he'd always possessed. A man comfortable with his skills and his place in the world. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Ellie," he said simply, using the nickname only he had ever been allowed. "Been a long time." Eleanor nodded, unable to find words for this man who represented both the happiness of her past and the isolation of her present. "She's inside," she managed finally. "Thank you for coming." Dr. Walker's examination was thorough and professional, his manner gentle as he worked around Maria's obvious fear. Eleanor translated when necessary, surprised to find herself acting as a bridge between these two people when she had spent so long burning bridges in her own life. "It's a stress fracture," Dr. Walker concluded, carefully wrapping Maria's ankle with practiced efficiency. "Not uncommon in people who spend long hours on their feet. But what concerns me more is that it's been left untreated for so long that it's developed complications. She needs proper medical care, Ellie. X-rays, possibly a walking boot, definitely. Physical therapy. And if that's not possible?" Eleanor asked quietly, acutely aware of Maria's frightened eyes following their conversation. "Then she risks permanent damage. Chronic pain at best, disability at worst." He paused, studying Eleanor's face with the insight of someone who had known her in both joy and grief. "But you didn't call me just to hear that, did you?" Eleanor shook her head. "I need options, Tommy, real ones." Later, after Dr. Walker had left with promises to return and Maria had been settled in the ranch's rarely used guest room, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee grown cold between her palms. The house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional creaking of timbers as the temperature dropped with the setting sun. The problem before her was not simple. Maria needed specialized medical care that would require insurance, identification, questions Eleanor wasn't sure either of them was prepared to answer. More than that, with Maria unable to work, her family, 2 children Eleanor had heard about but never seen, would be without income or support. Eleanor's own isolation had been a choice, a retreat from pain into the familiar routines of the ranch. But as she sat contemplating the woman resting upstairs, she began to recognize something in Maria that mirrored her own experience, a woman shouldering burdens alone, making choices based on survival rather than comfort, living a life defined by what had been lost rather than what might be found. The following morning brought clarity with the dawn. Eleanor rose early as always, completed her morning chores with the efficiency of long practice, then returned to the house to find Maria attempting to navigate the stairs on a makeshift crutch fashioned from an old broom. "What are you doing?" Eleanor demanded, rushing to steady the younger woman before she could fall. "The children," Maria explained, her face drawn with pain and worry. "They are with my cousin in town, but she works nights. I need to get back. They will be wondering where I am." Eleanor helped Maria back to the guest room, settling her on the edge of the bed before speaking. "I'm going to get them," she said with decision. "Your children. They'll stay here while you heal." Maria stared at her in disbelief. "Ms. Montgomery, you don't understand. I can't pay rent. And Lucia is only 7. Miguel is 10. Children make noise, they make mess. This house hasn't had noise or mess in far too long," Eleanor interrupted, surprising herself with the truth of the words. "Give me your cousin's address. I'll bring them back this afternoon." The drive into Clearwater Creek felt strange after months of avoiding town, except for essential supplies. Eleanor navigated her aging truck through streets that held too many memories, past the small elementary school where her own children had once played, the church where she had said final goodbyes to her family. The town had changed in the years of her self-imposed exile. New businesses had opened, old ones had closed. Faces she didn't recognize walked the sidewalks alongside those she had known all her life. Maria's cousin lived in a small apartment complex on the edge of town, the kind of place where rent was cheap and questions were few. The woman who answered Eleanor's knock looked exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes speaking of too many night shifts and too little rest. "I'm Eleanor Montgomery," she introduced herself simply. "I've come for Maria's children." The suspicion in the woman's eyes was immediate and understandable. "Where is Maria? Why would she send you?" Eleanor explained the situation as concisely as possible, aware that her reputation as a recluse wasn't helping to establish trust. "Maria is staying at my ranch while her ankle heals. She asked me to bring the children to her." Before the cousin could respond, a small face appeared around the doorframe, dark eyes serious in a heart-shaped face. "Is my mama okay?" the little girl asked, her English perfect, though tinged with the same accent as her mother's. "She's resting," Eleanor answered, finding herself kneeling to meet the child's eyes. "She hurt her ankle and needs to stay off. If for a while. Would you like to come stay with her at my ranch? There's lots of space to play and some horses you might like to meet." The girl, Lucia, Eleanor presumed, looked to her aunt for guidance, but it was a boy who appeared behind her, taller and with a protective hand on his sister's shoulder, who spoke next. "Why would you help us?" he asked bluntly, with the directness of a child who had learned early that kindness often came with conditions. Eleanor considered the question with the respect it deserved. "Because your mother has been kind to me," she said finally. "And because sometimes people need help, even when they're too proud to ask for it." It was the truth, though not the whole truth. Eleanor couldn't have explained, even to herself, the impulse that had driven her to this doorstep, that had opened her closely guarded home to strangers after years of solitude. All she knew was that Maria's quiet dignity in the face of pain had awakened something long dormant in her own heart, a recognition of shared struggle perhaps, or simply the human need for connection she had denied for too long. The children's few possessions fit into a single duffel bag. Eleanor watched as Miguel carefully packed his sister's favorite stuffed rabbit alongside his own treasured collection of polished rocks and a dog-eared Spanish-English dictionary. The careful way he ensured Lucia's comfort before his own spoke volumes about a boy who had shouldered responsibility beyond his years. The drive back to the ranch was quiet, the children watchful and wary in the back seat of Eleanor's truck. She made no attempt at forced conversation, respecting their uncertainty just as she would have respected a skittish colt's need for space to adjust to new surroundings. Maria's face when they arrived was a study in conflicting emotions, relief at seeing her children, embarrassment at their witnessing her vulnerability, and unmistakable anxiety about imposing on Eleanor's hospitality. But the children's joy at seeing their mother quickly overshadowed everything else. Lucia climbing carefully onto the bed to nestle against Maria's side, while Miguel stood tall beside them, his young face serious as he assessed his mother's condition. with the eyes of someone accustomed to being the man of the family. "Thank you," Maria whispered to Eleanor over the top of Lucia's dark head. "I will find a way to repay you." Eleanor shook her head. "Get some rest, we'll talk later." That evening, after showing the children to rooms that had stood empty for a decade, Eleanor found herself in her husband's old office, surrounded by the ledgers and accounts she had maintained with grim determination since his death. The ranch was solvent but not prosperous. She had managed to keep it running through sheer force of will and careful management, but there was little room for unexpected expenses. Dr. Walker's prescription for Maria sat on the desk before her: specialized orthopedic care, physical therapy, medications. Even with his promise to help navigate the system discreetly, the costs would be substantial. And beyond the immediate medical needs, there was the reality that Maria would be unable to work for weeks, possibly months. Eleanor ran her fingers over the framed photograph that still held pride of place on the desk: her husband James, smiling broadly with their 3 children gathered around him. James would have known what to do. He had been the one with easy charm and boundless compassion, the one who saw neighbors as extended family rather than threats to privacy. "What would you do, James?" she whispered to the empty room. "What's the right thing here?" The answer came not in words but in memory. James at the dinner table, telling their children stories of his own father's generosity during hard times, of neighbors helping neighbors through drought and disaster, of the unspoken covenant of rural communities to care for their own. The following morning, Eleanor made 2 phone calls before beginning her chores. The first was to Dr. Walker, confirming the appointment he had arranged with an orthopedic specialist, who owed him a favor and wouldn't ask too many questions. The second was to Meredith Collins, the local high school principal and one of the few people from Eleanor's previous life who still occasionally reached out, despite years of rebuffs. "Meredith," Eleanor said when the woman answered, her voice stiff with disuse of social niceties. "I need to enroll 2 children in school. Temporarily," she added, though something inside her questioned the qualifier even as she spoke it. Meredith's surprise was evident in her momentary silence, but, to her credit, she recovered quickly. "Of course, Eleanor. Why don't you bring them by tomorrow? We can handle the paperwork then." Eleanor hesitated. There might be some complications with documentation. The understanding in Meredith's voice was immediate. "We've handled similar situations before, Eleanor. No child gets turned away from education in my school." The days that followed established a new rhythm at the Double M Ranch. Eleanor rose before dawn as always, but now she prepared breakfast for 4 instead of 1. Miguel shadowed her through morning chores, his questions about cattle and horses, and the mechanics of ranch life, breaking the silence Eleanor had cultivated for so long. Lucia spent hours beside her mother, drawing pictures or reading aloud from books Eleanor had unearthed from the attic, relics of her own children's early years. Dr. Walker became a regular visitor, checking Maria's progress and often staying. For the simple meals Eleanor now prepared with more care than she had shown her own nutrition in years. Sometimes he brought medical supplies. Other times he arrived with books for the children or gossip from town that made Maria smile despite her discomfort. It was during one of these visits, as they sat on the porch watching Miguel teach Lucia how to throw a lasso using techniques he had observed during Eleanor's work with the cattle, that Dr. Walker voiced what Eleanor had been avoiding. "The specialist says she needs surgery, Ellie. The fracture isn't healing properly, and there's damage to the surrounding tissue that needs repair." Eleanor nodded, having expected this development. "I'll cover it," she said simply. Dr. Walker studied her profile in the fading light. "That's a significant expense. I'm aware. The recovery will be months, not weeks." "I know that too." He hesitated, then asked the question that hovered between them. "What happens after, when she's healed?" Eleanor didn't have an answer. The temporary arrangement had already stretched from days into weeks, the children now enrolled in school. Their bus stop added to the rural route that passed the ranch driveway. Miguel had proved surprisingly capable with the livestock, his natural affinity for animals and quick learning, making him a genuine help rather than a hindrance. Lucia's laughter had begun to fill the house, her initial shyness giving way to a bubbling enthusiasm that reminded Eleanor painfully of her own daughter at that age. And Maria, even confined to bed or chair, had transformed the ranch house from a museum of grief into something approaching a home again. Her suggestions for rearranging furniture to allow her easier access had led to conversations about design and function, about making spaces work for the people who inhabited them rather than preserving them as shrines to the past. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted finally. "I haven't thought that far ahead." But that night, as she reviewed the ranch accounts and calculated the cost of the upcoming surgery against her savings, Eleanor was forced to confront the reality of her situation. The ranch had been breaking even, but just barely. The additional expenses of 3 more people, medical bills, school supplies, increased food costs, were rapidly depleting the emergency fund she had maintained through years of careful economy. There were options, of course. The north pasture could be sold. It was the least productive section of the ranch but would fetch a good price from developers, eager to build vacation homes with mountain views. Or she could take out a loan against the property, gambling on better cattle prices in the coming year. Neither option appealed to her sense of stewardship for the land that had been in her husband's family for generations. Eleanor was still contemplating these unpleasant choices when a soft knock sounded at the office door. Maria stood in the doorway, balancing carefully on the crutches Dr. Walker had provided, her face drawn with more than physical pain. "Ms. Montgomery," she began, then corrected herself. "Eleanor, I heard you talking with Dr. Walker today about the surgery." Eleanor gestured to the chair across from her desk, watching as Maria maneuvered herself into it with determined dignity. "It's necessary for proper healing," she said simply. "It's expensive," Maria countered. "Too expensive. I've been adding up in my head what you have already spent. The doctor visits, the medications, the special boot. And beyond that, keeping U.S. here, feeding my children, enrolling them in school." She shook her head. "It's too much. I can't allow you to do more. What's your alternative?" Eleanor asked, more bluntly than she had intended. Maria's eyes dropped to her hands, twisted together in her lap. "My cousin knows someone, a man who fixes broken bones for people like me. People without papers. He's not a real doctor, but he helps when official medicine is not possible." The thought of Maria subjected to unlicensed treatment by some back-alley bone setter sent a chill through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the autumn night growing cold outside. "Absolutely not," she said firmly. "Then I will go back to Mexico," Maria said with quiet resignation. "My mother is still there. She can help with the children while I heal." "And then what? You'll try to cross the border again? Risk your life? And leave your children orphaned if something goes wrong?" Eleanor's voice rose with an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, genuine fear for another person. Maria's silence was answer enough. Eleanor rose from behind the desk, moving to the window that overlooked the ranch yard. In the moonlight, she could make out the shapes of the barn, the corrals, the bunkhouse that had stood empty since she'd let the last ranch hand go 3 years earlier, choosing to manage the reduced herd herself rather than pay wages she could barely afford. "There's another option," she said finally, turning back to face Maria, "one that might solve both our problems." As Eleanor outlined her proposal, she watched Maria's expression shift from confusion to disbelief to cautious hope. By the time she finished speaking, tears shone in the younger woman's eyes. "Why would you do this?" Maria asked, echoing her son's question from weeks earlier. "You barely know us." Eleanor considered her answer carefully. "Because this ranch is too big. For one person." Because your children bring life to a house that has been half dead for too long. Because you see me, not as the tragic widow or the reclusive rancher, but just as a person." She paused. "And because I'm tired of being alone." The truth of the last statement surprised her even as she spoke it. Solitude had been her choice, her protection against further loss. But somewhere in these weeks of shared meals and children's homework and Maria's quiet presence, Eleanor had remembered what it was to be part of something larger than her own grief. The following day, Eleanor drove into town with purpose, stopping first at the bank where her family had done business for generations. The loan officer's surprise at seeing her was evident, but he recovered quickly, professional courtesy masking his curiosity about her unusual request. Next came the law office of Benjamin Foster, a contemporary of her husband's who had handled the ranch's legal affairs since before Eleanor's marriage. The elderly attorney listened without interruption as Eleanor explained what she wanted, his bushy eyebrows rising only slightly at certain details of her plan. "It's unorthodox," he said when she had finished. "But not impossible. There will be questions, of course." "Let them question," Eleanor replied with a shrug that would have been unthinkable months earlier. "I know what I'm doing." Her final stop was the clinic where Dr. Walker maintained his practice. He was between patients when she arrived, able to spare a few minutes in his cluttered office were diplomas, shared wall space with children's artwork, and thank you cards from grateful patients. "You've made a decision," he observed, reading her resolved expression. Eleanor nodded. "I have. And I'll need your help to make it work." By the time Eleanor returned to the ranch that evening, the framework of her plan was in place. The details would take time to arrange, paperwork to file, questions to answer. But the core of it was simple. The Double M Ranch would become a partnership. Maria and her children would have a home, legitimate employment, a path to security. Eleanor would have helped managing the ranch, company in the big house that had echoed with absence for too long, and perhaps most importantly, a purpose beyond mere survival. Maria listened to Eleanor's explanation with growing amazement, her children seated beside her on the living room sofa that had rarely been used since the funerals. "You would do this for us?" she asked when Eleanor had finished outlining the details. "Make us partners in your ranch? Help with our legal status?" "Not for you," Eleanor corrected gently. "With you, there's a difference." Miguel, who had been listening with the serious attention he brought to everything, spoke up. "What would we have to do?" "To earn it?" Eleanor smiled at the boy's practical question. "Work hard. Learn everything I can teach you about ranching. Help make this place profitable again." She paused. "And maybe, sometimes, remind me how to live instead of just existing." The weeks that followed brought changes to the Double M Ranch that would have been unimaginable to Eleanor a season earlier. Maria's surgery was successful, her recovery beginning under the watchful eyes of Dr. Walker and the enthusiastic nursing of her children. The spare bedroom was transformed into a proper rehabilitation space, with equipment borrowed from the clinic and exercises Maria performed with determined diligence. Eleanor, with Benjamin Foster's guidance, began the complex process of establishing the ranch as a limited liability company with Maria as a partner. The legal maneuvering required to address Maria's immigration status was more complicated, but the attorney had connections with advocacy groups specializing in such cases, particularly where children and legitimate employment were involved. Word of Eleanor's actions spread through Clearwater Creek with the speed of all small-town news. Reactions were mixed. Some neighbors applauded her compassion. Others muttered about illegal immigrants taking American jobs, and many simply wondered what had prompted the reclusive widow to emerge so dramatically from her self-imposed isolation. Eleanor ignored the gossip, focused instead on the practical aspects of integrating the Diaz family into the ranch operations. Miguel proved to have a natural affinity for the mechanical aspects of ranch work, absorbing Eleanor's lessons about equipment maintenance with an enthusiasm that reminded her painfully of her own son. Lucia, though younger, showed a surprising talent with the horses, her gentle approach winning over even the most temperamental mare in the small remuda. As Christmas approached, bringing with it the first heavy snows of the Montana winter, the changes at the ranch became more visible. Lights shone from windows that had remained dark for years. The scent of Maria's cooking, now prepared from a specially designed chair that allowed her to work while keeping weight off her healing ankle, wafted from the kitchen. Children's voices echoed through rooms that had known only silence. For too long, Dr. Walker's visits continued, ostensibly to check Maria's progress, but increasingly extending into shared meals and evenings by the fire, his presence filling yet another empty space in the home Eleanor had once thought would never feel complete again. His friendship with Maria blossomed alongside his rekindled connection with Eleanor, the three adults finding unexpected common ground in their shared experiences of loss and resilience. It was during one such evening, with the children already in bed and the adults lingering over coffee, that Maria raised a question that had hovered unspoken between them. "People in town are talking," she said quietly, "about why you are helping us." Eleanor's expression remained neutral. "People always talk. It doesn't matter." "It matters if it hurts you," Maria insisted. "If it damages your standing in the community." Dr. Walker leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Ellie's never much cared what people think. That's one of her finest qualities." Eleanor shot him a look that might have been irritation or gratitude. "The ranch is my business. What I do with it, who I choose to partner with, that's no one's concern but mine." Maria studied her for a long moment. "That is not an answer to why." The question hung in the air, demanding a truth Eleanor had been avoiding even with herself. Why had she upended her carefully constructed isolation for this family? Why risk financial stability, community standing, the protective walls of solitude she had maintained for a decade? "When I found you in the kitchen that day," Eleanor began slowly, "you reminded me of myself after the accident, injured, afraid, too proud to ask for help." She stared into her coffee cup as if reading the past in its depths. "But you had something I lost along with my family, a reason to heal. Your children needed you whole." She looked up, meeting Maria's steady gaze. "I think I needed that too. A reason beyond simple survival. A purpose that mattered more than just keeping this ranch going because it's what James would have wanted." Dr. Walker reached across the space between them, covering Eleanor's hand with his own. "James would be proud of what you're doing, Ellie. He always said this place was meant for family." Eleanor didn't withdraw from his touch as she once might have. "It's not just about honoring James anymore," she admitted. "It's about figuring out who I am now, who I can be going forward. And it turns out I'm someone who needs other people, even if I spent 10 years pretending otherwise." Maria's smile held understanding beyond words. "Sometimes the bravest thing is to let others see your broken places." The conversation shifted to more practical matters, the cattle that would need extra attention during the coming cold snap, Miguel's upcoming science project, the Christmas traditions that might be blended between Eleanor's Midwestern heritage and Maria's Mexican customs. But something had shifted permanently in the foundation of their unlikely partnership, an acknowledgement of the deeper currents that had brought them together. As winter settled fully over the ranch, transforming the landscape into a canvas of white broken only by the dark lines of fences and the smoke rising from the chimney, Eleanor found herself contemplating the year ahead with something approaching optimism. There would be challenges, certainly, Maria's ongoing recovery, the legal hurdles still to navigate, the financial tightrope of expanding the ranch operations to support 2 families. But for the first time in a decade, these challenges felt like opportunities rather than burdens. The quiet rancher who had found her limping maid in the kitchen had not only changed the trajectory of one family's life, but had fundamentally altered her own in ways that continued to unfold with each passing day. And if the town of Clearwater Creek was indeed left speechless by Eleanor Montgomery's transformation from reclusive widow to architect of this unconventional family, well, that was just one more change she was learning to accept with the grace that came from finally moving forward instead of merely standing still. The January snowfall blanketed the Double M Ranch in pristine white, transforming the Montana landscape into a wonderland of crystalline beauty and treacherous cold. Eleanor Montgomery stood at the kitchen window, watching as Miguel carefully navigated the shoveled path to the barn, his small figure determined against the backdrop of endless white. In the months since she had found Maria limping in this very kitchen, the rhythms of the ranch had transformed in ways Eleanor could never have anticipated, the silent rooms now filled with the sounds of life and purpose that had been absent for too long. "He insists on helping with the morning feeding," Maria observed, joining Eleanor at the window. Her recovery was progressing steadily, the walking boot replaced by a supportive brace that allowed her increasing mobility around the house. "I tell him you can manage, but he says a Montgomery-Diaz partnership means shared responsibilities." Eleanor smiled at the boy's adoption of her own phrases. "He's right. And he has good instincts with the animals." She turned from the window, studying Maria's face with the careful attention she brought to everything that mattered. "How's the pain today?" "Manageable," Maria replied, the honesty between them now established enough that Eleanor knew this wasn't merely brave words. "Dr. Walker says I might be ready for the physical therapy center in town next week, instead of just the home exercises." The mention of Thomas Walker brought a slight color to Eleanor's cheeks that she hoped Maria wouldn't notice. The doctor's increasingly frequent visits to the ranch had become a source of gentle teasing from Maria, who observed with quiet amusement the tentative rekindling of a connection that had been severed by grief and time. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, changing the subject as she poured coffee for them both, "about spring planting." Maria accepted the cup with a raised eyebrow. "In January? Even I know that's months away. Planning happens in winter, execution in spring." Eleanor settled at the kitchen table, spreading out a map of the ranch property that was worn at the creases from years of similar consultations. "The south field here has been fallow for 3 seasons. Good soil, protected from the worst winds by the ridge. I was thinking we might try something beyond the usual hay crop." Maria studied the map, her head tilted in consideration. "What did you have in mind?" "Vegetables," Eleanor said, watching for Maria's reaction. "Not commercial scale, at least not initially, but enough to supply us with fresh produce, maybe sell at the farmer's market in town during summer. Organic methods would be best. Fewer chemicals, better margins." Maria's expression shifted from surprise to thoughtful calculation. "It would require different equipment than what you have for the cattle operation. Different skills, too." "Skills you have," Eleanor pointed out. "I've seen your work with the herb garden you started on the kitchen windowsill. You have a touch with growing things." The small collection of pots that had appeared in the kitchen window shortly after Maria became mobile enough to tend them had flourished under her care, providing fresh herbs that transformed the simple ranch meals into something more vibrant and complex. Like so many changes Maria had brought to the Double M, it had happened gradually without fanfare, but with lasting impact. "A garden would be good for Lucia," Maria mused. "She loves helping with the herbs. And Miguel could design an irrigation system he's been reading about sustainable agriculture in the books Dr. Walker brought him." Eleanor nodded, pleased that Maria was engaging with the idea rather than dismissing it outright. "We'd start small, see what works in this climate, what we can manage with your recovery still ongoing. But it could be a way to diversify the ranch operations, make us less dependent on cattle prices." What Eleanor didn't say, but what hung in the air between them, was the financial reality that had become increasingly clear as she reviewed the ranch accounts. The Double M needed new revenue streams if it was to support 2 families comfortably. The cattle operation was stable but not prosperous, the margins too thin to accommodate the additional expenses that had accumulated in recent months. Maria seemed to hear the unspoken concern. "The medical bills from the surgery," she said quietly. "They are causing problems?" Eleanor shook her head, unwilling to burden Maria with financial worries during her recovery. "We're managing. The partnership paperwork Benjamin is preparing will help with the legal structure for moving forward. This is about building something sustainable for the future, not just getting by in the present." Before Maria could press further, the back door burst open, bringing with it a swirl of cold air and Miguel's excited voice. "Miss Eleanor, come quick. Something's wrong with Starlight." Starlight was the ranch's oldest mare, a gentle palomino who had been Eleanor's husband's favorite mount and who now served primarily as a teaching horse for Lucia's beginning riding lessons. Eleanor was on her feet immediately, reaching for her coat and boots. "What's happening?" she asked, already moving toward the door with the urgency of a rancher who understood that animal emergencies waited for no one. "She's down in her stall," Miguel reported, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Won't get up even with grain. Her breathing sounds funny." Eleanor turned to Maria. "Call Dr. Walker. Tell him we might need the large animal vet from Bozeman. If it's what I think it is, then keep Lucia inside. No need for her to see this until we know what we're dealing with." The barn was warmer than the outside air, but still cold enough that Eleanor could see her breath as she moved quickly to the stall where Starlight lay on her side, her breathing labored and her eyes showing the white that indicated distress. Miguel hovered anxiously at Eleanor's shoulder as she knelt beside the horse, running experienced hands over the animal's neck and chest. "Colic?" Miguel asked, demonstrating the knowledge he had been absorbing from Eleanor's lessons about ranch animal health. "I think so. And at her age, that's serious." Eleanor checked the horse's gums, noting the concerning color. "We need to get her up if possible. Walking helps with digestive colic." For the next hour, Eleanor and Miguel worked together to encourage the elderly mare to her feet, using gentle pressure and coaxing words. When Dr. Walker arrived, he brought not only his own limited large animal experience, but also a conference call with the veterinarian from Bozeman, who provided guidance through the examination and initial treatment. "Keep her walking if you can. Get her up," the vet advised through the speakerphone. "Clear liquid only, no feed until I can get there. I'm finishing an emergency C-section on a heifer, but I can be at your place by early afternoon." Throughout the crisis, Miguel remained steadfast, following Eleanor's instructions without question and offering his own observations about the horse's condition with surprising insight. His calm competence in the face of emergency spoke volumes about the boy's character and his growing connection to the ranch and its animals. By the time they returned to the house, tired and smelling of horse and medicine, Lucia had set the kitchen table for lunch, and Maria had prepared a simple meal of soup and sandwiches. The domestic scene, so ordinary in most households, still remarkable in what had once been Eleanor's silent, empty house, struck her with unexpected force. This was what she had been missing in the years of isolated grief. Not just companionship, but purpose beyond her own survival. The shared concern for Starlight, Miguel's willingness to work alongside her without complaint, Lucia's earnest contribution to their comfort, Maria's steady presence coordinating it all. These were the elements of a functioning family, responding together to both crisis and routine. Dr. Walker joined them for lunch, his medical bag set aside as he listened to Lucia's detailed explanation of her school project on Montana wildlife. The easy way he engaged with the child, drawing out her knowledge and gently correcting misconceptions, reminded Eleanor of how he had once been with her own children, a family friend as much as a doctor, a man who understood that healing happened in many forms. "The vet from Bozeman called while you were washing up," he told Eleanor as Lucia finished her presentation. He's running behind but should be here by 4. I can stay until then, if you'd like another set of hands." Eleanor nodded gratefully. "Miguel and I will need to keep walking her once she's stable enough. An extra person would help." "I want to help too," Lucia declared, her small face serious with concern for the horse she had come to love during her riding lessons. Maria exchanged a glance with Eleanor, a silent communication that had developed between them over the months of shared parenting. "Perhaps you can help in a different way," Maria suggested to her daughter. "The vet might be hungry after his long drive. You and I could prepare something for him to eat when he finishes with Starlight." Lucia considered this assignment with the gravity it deserved. "Like the empanadas we made for Miss Eleanor's birthday?" "Exactly like that," Maria agreed. "Important. Work requires good food to sustain it." The afternoon unfolded in a coordinated effort that demonstrated how thoroughly the Montgomery and Diaz families had integrated their lives and skills. Eleanor and Miguel maintained their vigil with Starlight, joined by Dr. Walker, who monitored the horse's vital signs and maintained communication with the veterinarian. Maria and Lucia worked in the kitchen, preparing not only the promised empanadas, but also a hearty stew that would provide dinner for everyone involved in the emergency care. When the veterinarian finally arrived, a weather-beaten man named Dr. Peterson, with decades of large animal experience evident in his confident handling of Starlight, he found not a crisis managed by a solitary rancher, but a coordinated family. Response: his treatment of the elderly Mare was thorough and ultimately optimistic. "She's responding well to the medication," he told Eleanor as they stood watching Starlight, now back on her feet and accepting small sips of water. "Good thing you caught it early and got her moving. At her age, this could have gone south quickly." "It was Miguel who found her," Eleanor said, nodding toward the boy who was carefully measuring out the electrolyte solution Dr. Peterson had prescribed. "He checks each animal first thing every morning, rain or shine." The veterinarian studied Miguel with professional appreciation. "You've got a good eye, young man." Noticed something was off before it became critical. "That's a skill some ranchers twice your age haven't mastered." Miguel straightened under the praise, his expression serious but pleased. "Ms. Eleanor taught me what to look for. And my papa always said animals tell you when they're hurting if you know how to listen." It was the first time Miguel had mentioned his father, a subject that had remained notably absent from family conversations. Eleanor had never pressed, respecting the privacy of whatever circumstances had led Maria to leave Mexico with her children and make the dangerous journey north alone. Dr. Peterson nodded as if this was the most natural explanation in the world. "Your papa was right about that. You keep listening like you are, and you'll make a fine rancher someday." Later, after the veterinarian had been fed and sent on his way with Maria's empanadas for the road, and after Starlight had been settled for the night with Miguel volunteering to sleep in the barn to monitor her condition, Eleanor found herself on the porch with Dr. Walker. Despite the cold, they sat side by side in the wooden rocking chairs that had been fixtures on the Montgomery porch for generations, watching the winter stars emerge in a sky of infinite clarity. "You've built something remarkable here, Ellie," Dr. Walker said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "In just a few months." Eleanor shook her head slightly. "I haven't built it alone. Maria and the children, they've brought as much to this place as I have." "That's not how Maria tells it. According to her, you've given them everything. A home, security, a future." "We've given each other what we needed," Eleanor corrected, watching her breath form clouds in the cold air. "That's what partnership means." Dr. Walker studied her profile in the dim light spilling from the kitchen window. "You've changed since they came." The observation might once have felt like criticism, but Eleanor recognized it now as simple truth. "I needed to change. I was existing, not living. Coming home each night to an empty house, waking up each morning with nothing but chores and memories." She turned to face him directly. "You tried to tell me that years ago. I wasn't ready to hear it." "Grief takes its own time," he said simply. "You can't rush healing, in bodies or in hearts." The conversation shifted to Starlight's treatment plan, to Miguel's evident aptitude for ranch work, to the vegetable garden Eleanor was proposing for the spring planting. But beneath these practical matters ran a current of deeper understanding, of two people rediscovering the friendship that had been interrupted by tragedy and might now be cautiously resuming on new terms. February brought a gradual thaw to the Fayodud Double M Ranch, not just in the weather, which remained firmly in winter's grip, but in Eleanor's long-frozen capacity for connection. The vegetables garden shifted from concept to concrete planning, with Maria and Lucia poring over seed catalogs in the evenings and Miguel designing an irrigation system that incorporated rainwater collection from the barn roofs. Starlight recovered fully from her bout with colic, though the experience underscored the Mare's advancing age and the need to begin thinking about retiring her from even the light duties she currently performed. This led to conversations about possibly expanding the ranch's small horse breeding program, focusing on the gentle temperament and sure-footedness that made Starlight and horses like her so valuable for working in Montana's challenging terrain. These discussions about the ranch's future took place around the kitchen table, in the barn while mucking stalls, during drives into town for supplies, the everyday moments where families naturally plan and dream together. Eleanor found herself consulting Maria and even Miguel on decisions she would once have made alone, valuing their perspectives and the different experiences they brought to ranch management. Word of the changes at the Double M spread through Clearwater Creek, transforming the local perception of Eleanor Montgomery from tragic recluse to something more complex and interesting. When she began appearing at school events with Maria and the children, some neighbors viewed the arrangement with suspicion, muttering about illegal immigrants and questioning Eleanor's judgment. But others, particularly those who had known Eleanor before tragedy reshaped her life, saw the partnership for what it was, a chance at healing and renewal for everyone involved. Meredith Collins, the high school principal who had facilitated Miguel and Lucia's enrollment, despite their complicated documentation situation, became a regular visitor to the ranch. Her professional interest in the children's educational progress provided the initial reason for her visits, but her genuine enjoyment of Maria's cooking and Eleanor's dry humor kept her returning, long after her official duties were satisfied. Miguel's science teacher says his irrigation design could qualify for the regional STEM competition, she reported during one such visit in late February. "It's quite sophisticated for a fifth grader, incorporating gradient calculations and water conservation principles that are usually introduced in high school." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised by this assessment of Miguel's abilities. "He's been studying the ranch's water system since he arrived. Figured out a flow problem in the South Pasture pipeline that I'd been fighting for 3 seasons. And Lucia's artwork is extraordinary," Meredith continued. "Her teacher wants to submit it to a statewide exhibition for elementary students, but there's a permission issue." She hesitated, glancing toward the living room where Maria was helping Lucia with her reading assignment. Eleanor understood immediately. "The documentation question," Meredith nodded. "The exhibition requires a social security number for the submission forms. I've been working around these issues for school enrollment, but external programs are more complicated." This was just one of many such barriers the family had encountered, the invisible walls that separated those with legal status from those without. Eleanor had experienced similar challenges when attempting to add Maria and the children to the ranch's health insurance policy, when opening a bank account for the business partnership, when registering Miguel for the 4-H program he was eager to join. Benjamin Foster, Eleanor's attorney, had been navigating these complexities with the diligence of someone who understood both the letter of immigration law and the human realities behind it. The partnership structure for the ranch was now in Place, providing Maria with legitimate employment documentation that represented the first step toward more stable legal status. But the process was slow, complicated by changing policies and the backlog of similar cases throughout the system. "I'll speak with Benjamin," Eleanor told Meredith. "There may be a workaround he can suggest." Lucia's talent deserves recognition. After Meredith left, Eleanor found Maria in the kitchen preparing dinner, her movements still careful but increasingly fluid as her recovery progressed. The physical therapy sessions in town were producing visible results, though Maria admitted privately to Eleanor that the pain remained significant, particularly after long days of activity. Meredith says Lucia's artwork might be selected for a statewide exhibition, Eleanor said, reaching for plates to set the table, another household task that had once been performed mechanically but now carried the satisfaction of preparing for a family meal. Maria's hands stilled momentarily over the cutting board. "That would be wonderful, but I know the paperwork complications." Eleanor arranged the plates with more force than necessary. "Benjamin is making progress, but it's a slow process." Maria resumed chopping vegetables with practiced efficiency. "We are patient, and already more fortunate than many in our situation." Eleanor studied her partner's profile, noting the quiet dignity that had first drawn her attention that day in the kitchen months earlier. "It shouldn't be this difficult. You contribute so much to this ranch, to the community. The children are thriving in school, bringing talents and perspectives that enrich everyone around them." "The system doesn't see individuals," Maria said simply. "It sees categories, documents, rules. Then the system is broken." Maria's smile held both warmth and resignation. "Many systems are broken. We find ways to work within them, around them, or to build new ones." She gestured around the kitchen, encompassing by extension the entire ranch and the unconventional family they had created. "Like this. This is its own system, imperfect perhaps, but functioning. Built on trust and mutual need rather than paperwork." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the children, stomping snow from their boots at the back door after completing their afternoon chores. Miguel carried a detailed sketch of modifications he proposed for Starlight's stall, incorporating a gentle ramp to help the aging horse navigate the small step at the entrance. Lucia proudly displayed a drawing of the spring garden she envisioned, complete with labeled rows of vegetables and a scarecrow wearing what appeared to be Eleanor's favorite hat. Dinner that evening, like most meals at the Double M now, was filled with conversation. Miguel's excited description of the lamb birthing he had witnessed at a neighboring ranch. Lucia's report on the owl family nesting in the old oak near the creek. Maria's plans for expanding her herb garden when the weather permitted. Eleanor found herself speaking more than had once been her habit, sharing stories about the ranch's history that she had kept locked away with her grief for too long. "My husband's grandfather planted those oak trees," she told the children. Response to Lucia's owl report. "Brought the saplings all the way from Kentucky because he missed the trees from his childhood. Everyone said they wouldn't survive Montana winters, but he was stubborn. Said anything could take root with enough care and patience. Like us," Lucia said, with the straightforward wisdom of childhood. "We're taking root here too." The simple observation caught Eleanor off guard, bringing unexpected moisture to her eyes. "Yes," she agreed softly. "Exactly like that." Later that evening, after the children were in bed, Eleanor found Maria in the ranch office, studying the account. Ledgers with a concentration that spoke of genuine concern rather than idle curiosity. Eleanor had gradually introduced Maria to the financial aspects of ranch management, recognizing her partner's sharp mind for numbers and practical approach to budgeting. "The spring calving will help," Maria said without preamble, looking up from the columns of figures. "But we need to consider additional revenue streams before next winter. The vegetable garden will provide for our own needs, perhaps some farmers' market sales, but not significant income in its first year." Eleanor settled behind the desk, acknowledging with a nod the accuracy of Maria's assessment. "I've been thinking about the north pasture." Maria's expression sharpened. Eleanor had shared the history of the ranch property with her, including the fact that the north pasture, while the least productive for agricultural purposes, was the most valuable in terms of potential development. Situated with mountain views and road access, it represented a significant financial asset that Eleanor had refused to liquidate even during the leanest years after her husband's death. "You've always said that land would stay in the Montgomery family," Maria said carefully. "That your husband's grandfather purchased it specifically to prevent development that would destroy the view from the main house." "Times change," Eleanor replied, though the words cost her more than she allowed her expression to reveal. "Priorities shift." Maria studied her for a long moment. "This is because of us. The additional expenses. This is because the ranch needs to be sustainable for the future, for all of us." Eleanor pulled out a folder containing a proposal she had requested from a local real estate agent. "We wouldn't sell the entire parcel. Just the eastern portion. Enough for 2 or 3 home sites, well situated to minimize impact on the view and ranch operations." The proposal represented months of careful consideration, of weighing financial necessities against the stewardship obligations Eleanor felt toward the land her husband's family had protected for generations. It was a compromise that would provide immediate financial stability, while preserving the core of the ranch's identity and operations. Maria didn't immediately respond, her expression thoughtful as she reviewed the proposal. Finally she looked up, meeting Eleanor's gaze directly. "There's another option we haven't discussed. I'm listening." "Tourism," Maria said simply. "Agritourism specifically. The ranch has history, beauty, working operations that people from cities would pay to experience. We could offer accommodations in the bunkhouse, guided horseback rides, participation in seasonal activities like calving or harvesting." Eleanor's initial reaction was skepticism. The thought of strangers invading the privacy of the ranch, of turning working operations into spectacles for visitors, ran counter to generations of Montgomery tradition. But as Maria outlined her vision, limited numbers of guests, authentic experiences rather than manufactured attractions, educational components that would appeal to families and school groups, Eleanor found herself considering the possibility. It would require significant initial investment, she pointed out. Renovating the bunkhouse to acceptable standards, additional insurance coverage, marketing. "Less investment than you've already made in us," Maria countered gently. "And, unlike selling land, which can only be done once, this would create ongoing revenue while keeping the ranch intact." The conversation continued late into the night, weighing options and implications, calculating potential returns against necessary investments. By the time they finally retired, a new possibility had taken shape, one that might allow the double M to evolve without sacrificing its essential character or divesting precious land. March arrived with the promise of spring, though Montana's weather remained stubbornly unpredictable. Early morning chores were still performed in the gray light. Before dawn, breath-forming clouds in the cold air, boots crunching on frost-hardened ground. But by afternoon, hints of the coming season appeared, patches of bare earth emerging from melting snow, the first brave crocuses pushing through near the house's south foundation, calves testing wobbly legs in the birthing barn under Miguel's watchful eye. Eleanor found herself embracing the seasonal transition with an optimism she hadn't felt in years. The changes at the Double M extended beyond the addition of the Diaz family to a fundamental shift in Eleanor's relationship with her own grief. The memories of her husband and children remained, of course, present in the family photographs that had emerged from storage to hang alongside new images of ranch life, in stories shared around the dinner table, in quiet moments of reflection. But these memories no longer defined the boundaries of Eleanor's existence. Instead, she found herself increasingly engaged with the present and looking toward the future. The agritourism concept had evolved from late-night conversation to concrete business plan. With Benjamin Foster's help in navigating the legal requirements and Dr. Walker's unexpected connections to regional tourism, boards providing valuable guidance. Meredith Collins had introduced Eleanor and Maria to a grant program supporting women-owned agricultural businesses, opening possibilities for funding the bunkhouse renovation without selling ranch land. Even the vegetable garden had expanded beyond its original conception, with plans now including a teaching component that would allow school groups to learn about sustainable farming practices. Lucia had appointed herself official garden artist, creating cheerful signs identifying the various crops that would be planted once the soil was workable. As Eleanor watched these plans unfold, each one building on the unique contributions of their unconventional family partnership, she recognized how thoroughly her life had been transformed in the months since finding Maria limping in the kitchen. What had begun as a simple act of compassion, helping an injured employee, had evolved into something far more profound, the creation of a new kind of family, bound not by blood, but by choice and mutual commitment. The town of Clearwater Creek, initially skeptical of the arrangement at the Double M, had gradually shifted its collective opinion as evidence of the ranch's revival became apparent. The Montgomery-Diaz partnership's first official public appearance came at the annual Cattlemen's Association dinner, where Eleanor had been a solitary silent presence in years past, but now arrived with Maria at her side, both women dressed in careful compromise between ranching tradition and Maria's more colorful aesthetic sensibilities. The reactions ranged from warm welcome to barely concealed disapproval, but Eleanor found herself remarkably unconcerned with either extreme. The opinions that mattered were those of the people who had become her family, Maria's quiet pride as they discussed breeding strategies with other ranchers, Miguel's earnest questions about sustainable grazing techniques, Lucia's delight at being included in this grown-up event, Dr. Walker's steady presence offering support without intrusion. Spring on the Double M Ranch brought not just new life, in the form of calves and crops, but a resurrection of hope that Eleanor had once thought permanently buried alongside her first family. The quiet rancher who had found her limping maid in the kitchen had indeed left the town speechless, not merely with the unexpectedness of her actions, but with the undeniable evidence that sometimes the most profound healing comes through reaching beyond one's own pain to address the needs of others. As March gave way to April and the Montana landscape began its dramatic transformation from winter's grip to spring's abundance, Eleanor stood one evening at the same porch railing where she had contemplated her isolated existence months earlier. Behind her, through the windows of the now vibrant house, she could see Maria teaching Lucia to roll dough for empanadas. Miguel bent over homework at the kitchen table, and Dr. Walker, Thomas, as she had begun to call him again, arriving with books and medical supplies and the easy comfort of someone finding his own place within their evolving family circle. The Double M Ranch was changing, as all living things must change to survive and thrive. But unlike the changes grief had forced upon her a decade earlier, these transformations felt like growth rather than loss, like the natural progression of seasons rather than the abrupt amputation of possibility. The quiet rancher had found not just a limping maid, but a new vision of family, community, and purpose, and in doing so, had begun at last to heal the deepest wounds of her own heart. The first day of May dawned clear and warm, a perfect Montana spring morning that promised renewal after the long, harsh winter. Eleanor Montgomery stood on the newly rebuilt porch of the bunkhouse, clipboard in hand, surveying the transformation that 6 weeks of dedicated work had accomplished. What had once been a utilitarian structure designed for ranch hands was now a charming guest accommodation, with fresh paint and warm earth tones, new windows that captured the mountain views, and a covered porch where visitors could watch the sun set behind the western peaks. "What do you think?" Thomas Walker asked, joining her with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. In the months since his medical visits had evolved into personal ones, he had become an integral part of the Montgomery Diaz household, his gentle presence, filling gaps neither Eleanor nor Maria had fully recognized existed. Eleanor accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma before answering, "I think it's beautiful. Better than I imagined when Maria first proposed this idea." She gestured toward the interior, where Maria was directing the placement of handcrafted furniture built by a local artisan. "She has an eye for creating spaces that feel both functional and welcoming. She's had practice," Thomas observed, "making homes in difficult circumstances, finding beauty where others might see only utility." The insight struck Eleanor as profoundly true. Maria's talent for transforming spaces from the ranch house kitchen to this renovated bunkhouse was an extension of the resilience that had carried her through circumstances Eleanor could only imagine. The woman who had arrived at the Double M as a limping maid had revealed herself to be an artist in her own right, crafting environments that nurtured both body and spirit. "Our first guests arrive next weekend," Eleanor said, her voice holding both anticipation and lingering traces of anxiety. "The Peterson family from Minneapolis. Lawyers with 3 children who've never seen a working ranch. What if they hate it? What if the children are bored or frightened of the animals? What if they love it?" Thomas interrupted gently. "What if those city children discover passions for horses or gardening or open spaces that change the course of their lives? What if their parents remember what it means to disconnect from digital demands and reconnect with each other under Montana skies?" Eleanor smiled at his deliberate optimism. "When did you become such a romantic, Tommy Walker?" "Around the same time you stopped being such a pessimist, Ellie Montgomery," he returned, his eyes crinkling with the smile that had become increasingly familiar in recent months. Their conversation was interrupted by Miguel's arrival, his boots clattering on the porch steps as he rushed to share his latest discovery. "Miss Eleanor, Dr. Walker. Come quick, Starlight's foal is trying to stand." The elderly Mare's unexpected pregnancy had been discovered during her treatment for colic, a surprise that concerned Eleanor given Starlight's age, but that the veterinarian had cautiously suggested might proceed normally with careful monitoring. For months, Miguel had appointed himself Starlight's primary caretaker, spending hours in her stall reading aloud from his science textbooks and monitoring her condition with a dedication that impressed even Dr. Peterson, the veteran large animal veterinarian. The 3 of them hurried to the foaling barn, where Lucia was already perched on the stall divider, her sketchpad abandoned beside her as she watched the wobbly foal with undisguised wonder. The newborn, a delicate filly with her mother's palomino coloring but darker legs that hinted at her unknown sire's contribution, struggled repeatedly to coordinate her spindly limbs, collapsing in awkward heaps before determinedly trying again. "She's strong," Dr. Walker observed, his medical training supplementing Eleanor's practical experience with horses. "Good instincts, too. See how she keeps orienting toward her mother's milk?" Miguel nodded earnestly. "I read that foals should stand and nurse within the first hour. It's been 43 minutes since she was born." The precision of his timing revealed how closely he had been monitoring the birth process. Eleanor knelt at the stall door, her experienced eye assessing both Mare and foal. Starlight looked tired but not distressed, her attention focused entirely on her unexpected late-life offspring. The foal made another attempt to stand, legs splaying in 4 directions, before she managed to find a momentary balance. "There she goes," Eleanor murmured. "That's it, little one. Find your feet." As if responding to the encouragement, the filly steadied herself, stood swaying for several heartbeats, then took one tentative step toward her mother. The small triumph brought spontaneous applause from Lucia and a grin of pure joy to Miguel's serious face. "She needs a name," Lucia declared, reaching for her abandoned sketchpad to capture the moment. Miguel looked to Eleanor, understanding the ranch's naming traditions for new stock. Eleanor normally reserved this privilege for herself, part of the careful record-keeping that had sustained the Double M through generations of Montgomery stewardship. But today, watching Miguel's proud vigilance and Lucia's artistic documentation of the new arrival, she made a different choice. "I think you two should name her," Eleanor said. "You've earned that right with all your help preparing for her arrival." The siblings exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them before Miguel spoke. "Esperanza," he said firmly. "It means hope in Spanish. Because she was unexpected but welcome, like a hope you didn't know you had until it arrived." The name hung in the air between them, its significance extending beyond the foal to encompass everything that had unfolded at the Double M ranch since the day Eleanor had found Maria limping in the kitchen. Esperanza, hope unexpected, but welcome, arriving without warning to transform what had seemed a settled fate. "Esperanza Montgomery Diaz," Eleanor said, testing the sound of it. "Perfect." The birth of Esperanza became, in retrospect, the symbolic beginning of the ranch's new chapter. The following weekend brought the Peterson family from Minneapolis, the first official guests of the Double M Ranch Stay and Experience program. Their arrival in a luxury SUV with more electronic equipment than luggage initially confirmed Eleanor's worst fears about urban visitors, unable to appreciate the ranch's simpler rhythms. But by the end of their 3-day stay, 12-year-old Amanda Peterson was mucking stalls alongside Miguel without complaint. Her father had spent hours in quiet conversation with Eleanor about sustainable ranching practices, and their mother, a high-powered corporate attorney, had been discovered weeping with simple joy while watching Esperanza practice running in the spring sunshine. They departed with promises to return in the fall, leaving behind a generous gratuity and taking with them memories that Eleanor suspected might indeed change the trajectory of young Amanda's life. Other guests followed as spring gave way to early summer, a retired couple celebrating their 40th anniversary, a young family seeking respite from a child's serious illness, a group of teachers using their summer break to experience the agricultural lifestyle they taught about in classroom theory. Each visit brought new perspectives to the ranch and expanded the horizons of the Montgomery Diaz family in unexpected ways. The vegetable garden flourished under Maria's careful tending, becoming not just a source of fresh produce for the ranch kitchens but an educational feature for visitors and an unexpected therapeutic resource. Eleanor found herself intrigued by the way working the soil seemed to center Maria, how the simple acts of planting, weeding, and harvesting provided a visible satisfaction that transcended language and cultural differences. "My grandmother was a curandera, a healer," Maria explained one evening as they harvested early lettuce and herbs for dinner. "She believed working with plants connected us to both earth and spirit. When I was a girl, I thought this was just old superstition. Now I understand she was teaching me about finding peace in purposeful work, about the healing that comes through nurturing life." Eleanor nodded, recognizing the truth in Maria's words. "My husband's mother was similar. She called her garden her thinking place, said she solved more problems between rows of beams than she ever did indoors at a desk." These moments of shared insight had become increasingly common as the women's partnership deepened, beyond practical arrangements, into genuine friendship. Their backgrounds could not have been more different. Eleanor born to relative privilege on the very land she still worked, Maria navigating poverty and later displacement with only her intelligence and determination as resources. Yet they had found common ground in their approach to life's challenges, in their commitment to creating security for the children, in their quiet resilience in the face of loss. By June, the legal complexities surrounding Maria and the children's status had begun to show progress. Benjamin Foster, working with immigration advocacy organizations in both Montana and Washington, D.C., had secured temporary work authorization. documents that legitimized Maria's position as co-manager of the ranch's guest operations. The children's situation remained more complicated, but Miguel's extraordinary academic performance had attracted the attention of a state senator whose interest in education reform included advocating for undocumented students with exceptional potential. "It's not comprehensive immigration reform," Benjamin explained during a strategy meeting at the ranch, "but it creates a path forward through existing programs and exceptions. Maria's employment record, the children's integration into the community, the business partnership structure, all these elements strengthen the case for permanent residency under current guidelines." Eleanor nodded, relieved but still concerned. "And if the guidelines change, if policies shift again?" Benjamin's expression acknowledged the validity of her concern. "That's always a risk in immigration cases. But we're building the strongest possible foundation: legitimate employment, community ties, educational achievement. Those factors matter regardless of which way the political winds blow." Thomas, who had joined the meeting at Maria's request, added his medical perspective. "Maria's recovery has also created a compelling healthcare narrative. The surgical records, physical therapy documentation, and ongoing medical needs establish additional humanitarian considerations." Maria, who had been listening quietly to this discussion of her family's fate, finally spoke. "What matters most is that the children have stability now. They go to school without fear. They have enough food, warm beds, adults who care about their future." She looked at Eleanor with undisguised gratitude. "Whatever happens with papers and permits, you have already given us the most important thing: dignity." The summer months brought new challenges and opportunities to the Double M, the ranch's guest program, expanded beyond occasional weekend visitors to include a 2-week session for urban teenagers interested in agricultural careers, a partnership with the local community college that offered hands-on experience for veterinary technician students, and a specialized program for military veterans seeking peaceful transition to civilian life. This last initiative had been Thomas's suggestion, inspired by his work with former service members struggling with post-traumatic stress. "There's something about working with animals and land that reaches parts of the psyche conventional therapy sometimes can't access," he explained when proposing the idea. "The structured routine of ranch life, the immediate feedback from animal care, the physical exertion that exhausts the body enough for the mind to finally rest, these elements can be powerfully healing." Eleanor, initially hesitant about opening the ranch to individuals dealing with significant trauma, found her reservations dissolving after meeting the first group of veterans. Their quiet determination, their hunger for meaningful work, their evident relief at being in a place where hypervigilance was unnecessary. These qualities resonated with her own experience of using ranch work to navigate grief. By July, the Double M had transformed from a struggling cattle operation, managed by a reclusive widow, into a diversified agricultural enterprise that not only supported 2 families financially, but served the wider community in ways Eleanor could never have imagined. The town of Clearwater Creek, initially skeptical about the Montgomery-Diaz partnership, had come to recognize the economic benefits of the ranch's expanded operations, from increased business at local restaurants and shops to employment opportunities for area residents hired to help with the guest programs. Even those who had been most vocally opposed to Eleanor's harboring of illegals, as one particularly unpleasant county commissioner had phrased it, found their arguments undermined by the visible positive impact of the partnership. The ranch was thriving, the children were excelling in school, and the various educational programs were bringing welcome attention and resources to a region often overlooked in state economic development initiatives. "You've created something remarkable here," Meredith Collins observed during the Independence Day barbecue that had become an annual tradition at the Double M long before Eleanor's time, but that she had abandoned after her family's deaths. This year, at Maria's gentle insistence, they had revived the celebration, inviting neighbors, program participants, and community members to share food, music, and the spectacular view of fireworks over the valley. Eleanor shook her head, watching. As Maria directed the food preparation with the efficiency of a five-star chef, Miguel led pony rides for younger children, and Lucia distributed handmade decorations she had created for the occasion. "I didn't create this. We all did, together. I just provided the land." "You provided much more than that," Meredith countered. "You provided the courage to reimagine what this place could be, what a family could look like, what community really means." As twilight deepened and neighbors gathered on blankets to watch the distant fireworks, Eleanor found herself seated between Thomas and Maria, with the children sprawled on the grass before them. The moment felt suspended in time, the soft Montana evening, the anticipation of celebration, the comfortable silence of people who had learned to communicate beyond words. "Thank you," Maria said suddenly, her voice so quiet that only Eleanor could hear it. "For everything." Eleanor turned to her partner, seeing in Maria's face the same quiet strength that had first caught her attention that day in the kitchen, now tempered with something that looked remarkably like contentment. "Thank you," she returned simply, "for teaching me how to live again." The first explosion of color against the night sky drew gasps of appreciation from the assembled crowd. As red and gold light illuminated the faces around her, Eleanor recognized that the Double M Ranch had indeed become what Maria had once called it, its own system. Imperfect perhaps, but functioning. Built on trust and mutual need rather than conventional definitions of family or community. The quiet rancher who had found her limping maid in the kitchen had not only changed the trajectory of Maria's life, but had fundamentally altered her own understanding of purpose, belonging, and healing. The town might indeed have been left speechless by Eleanor Montgomery's transformation, but Eleanor herself had rediscovered her voice in advocacy for Maria and the children, in the revival of community traditions, in the simple daily acts of connection that had once seemed beyond her capacity for courage. As summer reached its peak of abundance, the Double M Ranch hosted its most ambitious event yet, an agricultural education day that brought over 200 visitors from across the county to learn about sustainable ranching practices, organic gardening techniques, and the integration of traditional knowledge with modern methods. The event had grown from a simple idea mentioned during a community council meeting to a full-scale demonstration of the ranch's evolution under the Montgomery-Diaz partnership. Eleanor, who once would have shunned such public exposure, found herself leading tours of the cattle operation, explaining breeding decisions and grazing, rotation with the quiet authority that came from generations of accumulated knowledge. Maria showcased the thriving vegetable gardens, now expanded to include medicinal herbs and native plants that honored both her grandmother's healing traditions and the indigenous practices of the region's original inhabitants. Miguel, now confidently bilingual and increasingly knowledgeable about ranch operations, demonstrated basic veterinary care techniques alongside Dr. Peterson, the large animal veterinarian who had become the boys' mentor and advocate for a potential future in veterinary medicine. Lucia, her artistic talents now receiving formal training through a special program Meredith Collins had arranged, created interactive displays explaining the ranch's seasonal rhythms through visual storytelling. Thomas Walker moved between these various stations, his medical perspective enriching discussions of animal welfare, human-livestock interaction, and the therapeutic benefits of agricultural work. His presence at Eleanor's side throughout the day felt natural now. The evolution of their relationship from doctor-patient to friends to something deeper having unfolded with the same organic inevitability as the ranch's transformation. As the event concluded and the last visitors departed, Eleanor found herself in the quiet of the ranch office with Maria, reviewing the day's success and planning for future programs. The financial ledgers before them told a story of remarkable turnaround, from the precarious situation of the previous year to a stable, Diversified operation that supported not just their families but provided employment for 4 local residents and educational opportunities for dozens more. "We should consider expanding the veterans program," Maria suggested, referring to the initiative that had proved particularly successful. "The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, and Thomas says there's a waiting list for the next session." Eleanor nodded, making notes in the careful handwriting that had tracked the ranch's fortunes through both prosperity and hardship. "We'll need additional sleeping quarters if we increase the numbers. Perhaps converting part of the equipment barn, since we consolidated the machinery storage." "Miguel has some ideas about that," Maria said with a smile that reflected her pride in her son's growing contribution to ranch planning. He's been sketching designs that incorporate solar heating and rainwater collection. The easy collaboration between them had become so natural that Eleanor sometimes forgot how improbable their partnership would have seemed to anyone who knew her before, the reclusive widow and the undocumented immigrant, building a business and a family together from the most unlikely beginning. Yet here they were, planning a future that neither could have imagined alone. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Benjamin Foster, his expression more animated than his usual professional reserve as he waved a large envelope. "It came through," he announced without preamble. "The work authorization renewals and the preliminary approval for the special visa application, based on Miguel's academic qualifications and the business partnership structure." Maria's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as the significance of this development registered. These weren't just documents. They represented security, legitimacy, the beginning of a path that might eventually lead to permanent residency. "It's not the final step," Benjamin cautioned, always the careful attorney. "There will be more paperwork, more waiting, more bureaucratic hurdles, but it's a substantial victory. The most difficult threshold has been crossed." Eleanor reached for Maria's hand, finding it trembling with emotion. "This calls for a celebration," she said, her own voice unsteady with shared joy. "Let's gather everyone for dinner tonight, you too, Benjamin. This affects all of us." The impromptu celebration that evening brought together the extended family that had formed around the Montgomery-Diaz partnership, Thomas Walker arriving with bottles of champagne and sparkling cider for the children, Meredith Collins bringing a cake decorated with congratulatory wishes. Benjamin Foster's normally serious demeanor relaxed into genuine pleasure at seeing the human impact of his legal work. As they gathered around the dining table that had once stood empty and unused for years, Eleanor found herself contemplating the strange path that had led to this moment. The devastating loss that had driven her into isolation, the chance encounter with a limping woman trying to hide her pain, the series of choices, some deliberate, others instinctive, that had gradually rebuilt something that could rightfully be called a family. Miguel, now showing signs of the young man he would soon become, raised his glass of sparkling cider with the solemnity that characterized his approach to important moments. "To Ms. Eleanor," he said, his English now nearly accent-free after months of dedicated study, "who saw people instead of problems and possibilities instead of risks." Lucia, never to be outdone by her brother, raised her own glass. "To Mama, who taught us that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what's right, even when you're terrified." Maria, her eyes bright with unshed tears, looked at her children with undisguised pride before turning to Eleanor. "To partnership," she said simply, "in all its forms." Thomas caught Eleanor's eye across the table, his expression conveying a private understanding of how far she had traveled from the grief-stricken woman who had pushed away his friendship years earlier. "To healing," he added quietly, "which comes in unexpected forms and often through unexpected people." Eleanor looked around the table at these people who had become essential to her life in ways she could never have anticipated that winter day when she found Maria limping in her kitchen. The quiet rancher had indeed left the town speechless with her unconventional choices. But in doing so, she had found her own voice again, in advocacy, in connection, in the courage to build something new from the ashes of loss. To family. Eleanor said, raising her glass to include everyone present. Not just the one you're born into, but the one you create through choice and commitment and love. She met Maria's eyes across the table, seeing in them the same recognition of how thoroughly their lives had been transformed through their unlikely partnership. And to limping maids who turn out to be so much more than they first appear. The laughter that followed was the sound of genuine joy, not the fleeting happiness of a momentary celebration, but the deeper contentment of people who had found their rightful places in each other's lives. The Double M Ranch had always been Eleanor's home, but now it had become something more, a place of possibility, of second chances, of family defined not by blood, but by shared purpose and mutual care. As the summer evening stretched into dusk and conversation flowed around the table, Eleanor Montgomery reflected that her decision to help a limping woman had not just changed Maria's life, it had saved her own. In reaching beyond her grief to address another's pain, she had inadvertently opened the door to her own healing. The town might indeed have been left speechless by her transformation, but Eleanor herself had found words again, for compassion, for connection, for the quiet courage that recognizes in another's vulnerability the reflection of one's own need for human bonds. The quiet rancher and the limping maid had built something remarkable, together, not just a business partnership or a blended household, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and its capacity to create family from the most unlikely beginnings. 5 years passed like seasons changing across the Montana landscape, each one bringing new growth and deeper roots for the family that had formed from the most unexpected beginning. The Double M Ranch, once struggling under the weight of Eleanor Montgomery's grief and isolation, had transformed into a thriving enterprise that defied conventional categorization, part cattle operation, part educational center, part healing sanctuary for those seeking reconnection with land and purpose. On a crisp September morning, Eleanor stood on the main house porch, coffee warming her hands as she watched the activity unfolding across the ranch yard. At 57, her face carried new lines that spoke of laughter as much as hardship. Her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical braid that had become her signature style. The decade of frozen grief that had once defined her was visible now only in old photographs and in the occasional distant look that crossed her face. On anniversary dates that would always carry the weight of remembrance. Miguel emerged from the barn, now 17 and nearly 6 feet tall, his gangly adolescence giving way to the confident movements of a young man who knew his place in the world. He led a group of veterans through the morning feeding routine, his instructions clear and patient as he demonstrated the therapeutic rhythm of agricultural work that had become the cornerstone of the ranch's most successful program. He's requested permission to apply early to the veterinary medicine program at Montana State, Thomas said, joining Eleanor with his own mug of coffee. The years had been kind to Thomas Walker as well, his medical practice now reduced to part-time. As he dedicated more hours to the ranch's programs and to the life he and Eleanor had carefully built together. Eleanor nodded, pride evident in her expression. Benjamin's already working on the documentation. The university has a special pathway for students in Miguel's situation, especially with his academic record and the recommendation letters from Dr. Peterson and the State Veterinary Association. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar truck coming up the long driveway, dust billowing behind it in the clear morning light. Maria returned from her weekly trip to town, the vehicle loaded with supplies for both the ranch kitchen and the expanded gardens that had become her domain over the years. At 41, Maria Diaz Montgomery, the legal name change, had been finalized 2 years earlier, another step in the family's ongoing journey toward security and belonging, had transformed as profoundly as the ranch itself. The woman who had Once hidden her pain for fear of losing essential employment, now moved with the confident grace of someone who knew her value, her worth, her rightful place in the world she had helped create. The legal status that had once seemed an insurmountable obstacle had been resolved through a combination of Benjamin Foster's determined advocacy, changing immigration policies, and the undeniable evidence of the Montgomery-Diaz partnership's contribution to the regional economy. The path hadn't been smooth or straightforward. There had been setbacks, moments of fear when policy shifts threatened their progress, bureaucratic delays that tested everyone's patience. But 3 years earlier, on a summer afternoon Eleanor counted among the happiest of her life, Maria, Miguel, and Lucia had taken the oath of citizenship in a courthouse filled with friends who had become family. "Eleanor," Maria called, waving a large envelope as she parked the truck. It came, Lucia's acceptance package from the Arts Institute. Eleanor hurried down the porch steps, Thomas close behind, to meet Maria at the vehicle. Lucia's application to the prestigious Montana Arts Institute's special high school program had been the focus of much anxious waiting over the past weeks. At 14, Lucia's artistic talents had blossomed far beyond childhood promise into genuine ability that had attracted attention from educators across the state. Maria handed the envelope to Eleanor, her eyes bright with emotion. "She wanted you to open it. Said it should be all of us together when we find out. Let's get her from the guest cottage first," Eleanor suggested, referring to the small building where Lucia now spent much of her time working on the illustrated guidebooks that had become a popular item in the ranch's small gift shop. What had begun as simple sketches of ranch life had evolved into a series of educational materials that combined Lucia's artistic vision with educational content about sustainable agriculture, the ecology of the region, and the human stories of rural Montana. The family gathered in the main house living room, now filled with photographs documenting their shared journey, Miguel receiving academic awards, Lucia at her first art exhibition, Maria and Eleanor cutting the ribbon on the expanded educational center that now occupied the converted equipment barn. Among these newer images, Eleanor had placed photographs of her first family, not segregated as relics of a separate life, but integrated into the visual story of all that had shaped the present reality. Lucia, her dark hair now styled in a fashionable bob that reflected her artistic sensibilities, bounced with nervous energy as Eleanor carefully opened the envelope. "Whatever it says," the girl declared with practiced maturity, "I'm grateful for the opportunity to apply. The process itself taught me so much about presenting my work professionally." Eleanor smiled at this rehearsed speech, recognizing it as Lucia's attempt to prepare herself for possible disappointment. But as she unfolded the letter inside, her smile widened into genuine delight. "Dear Lucia Montgomery Diaz," she read aloud, "we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the Montana Arts Institute's Young Artists program with a full scholarship for the 2023 to 2024 academic year." The room erupted in celebration, Maria embracing her daughter with tears of joy, Miguel lifting his sister in a bear hug that displayed both his growing strength and the deep bond between siblings who had navigated so much together, Thomas offering congratulations with the proud expression of a man who had watched this family overcome obstacles that would have defeated less determined spirits. As the initial excitement settled into happy planning discussions about logistics, the program would require Lucia to live on campus during the week, returning to the ranch on weekends. Eleanor found herself momentarily overcome by the magnitude of the journey they had traveled together. From a limping maid hiding her pain to a family celebrating educational triumphs that would have seemed impossible just 5 years earlier, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Later that afternoon, as they hosted a small celebration dinner for Lucia with Benjamin Foster, Meredith Collins, and other members of their extended community family, Eleanor slipped away briefly to the quiet of her office. The room had evolved along with everything else at the Double M, now housing not just ranch accounts, but education program materials, veterans program documentation, and the framed awards recognizing the Montgomery-Diaz Partnership's contributions to agricultural innovation and community development. Eleanor opened the bottom drawer of her desk, removing a worn leather journal she had maintained since the early days of Maria's arrival at the ranch. Unlike the business ledgers that tracked financial progress, this private record documented the emotional landscape of their evolving family, moments of breakthrough, challenges overcome, small victories that might otherwise have been forgotten in the forward momentum of their shared life. She turned to an entry from 4 years earlier, written shortly after they had launched the Veterans program that would eventually become the ranch's most recognized contribution to the wider community. Today I watched Maria working with staff. Sergeant Collins showing him how to transplant tomato seedlings. His hands, which he told me have held weapons more often than tools for the past decade, trembled at first. Maria simply placed her hands over his, steadying them without comment, without drawing attention to his vulnerability. Later I saw him working alone, those same hands now confident in the soil. I remember when my hands trembled too, with grief, with isolation, with the weight of continuing when everything seemed lost. Different circumstances, same human need for gentle guidance back to steady ground. We are all, in our own ways, healing through this work. The ranch is no longer just a business to maintain or land to preserve. It has become a place of restoration. Not just for cattle and crops, but for human spirits, including my own. The reflection captured what Eleanor now recognized as the true miracle of the Montgomery-Diaz partnership. Not just the practical success of their diversified business model or the legal victories that had secured Maria and the children's status, but the healing community they had created together. A place where broken people could find paths toward wholeness through meaningful work and genuine connection. Eleanor closed the journal as Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression questioning. "Everything all right?" "The natives are getting restless about cutting Lucia's cake." Eleanor smiled, returning the journal to its drawer. "Just taking a moment to appreciate how far we've come. It feels important to mark these milestones, not just with celebration, but with reflection." Thomas nodded, understanding as he always did the deeper currents beneath Eleanor's practical exterior. From a limping maid and a reclusive rancher, to this extraordinary family. It's a story no one would believe if they hadn't witnessed it themselves. "Speaking of stories," Eleanor said, rising to rejoin the celebration, "I've been thinking about the book Maria's been encouraging me to write about the ranch's transformation, the Veterans Program, our unconventional path to becoming a family. Maybe it's time to start putting those experiences on paper, not just for ourselves, but for others who might find hope in unlikely partnerships." The quiet rancher finally ready to tell her story? Thomas teased gently, offering his hand as they walked back toward the dining room where laughter and conversation spilled into the hallway. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Your journey together has already inspired this community. Imagine how many others might find courage in hearing about what you've built from such an unexpected beginning." The following spring brought another milestone to the Double M Ranch, the 10th anniversary of Maria's arrival. What had begun as a simple employment relationship between a reclusive rancher and a limping maid had evolved into a partnership that transformed not just their own lives, but the wider community around them. To mark the occasion, the Montgomery-Diaz family hosted an open house that drew visitors from across the state. Agricultural officials interested in their innovative programs, educators studying their model of experiential learning, veterans who had found healing through their specialized retreats, and neighbors who had witnessed the ranch's remarkable evolution from struggling cattle operation to thriving community resource. The celebration centered around the unveiling of a new initiative, the Montgomery-Diaz Agricultural Education Foundation, established to provide scholarships for undocumented students pursuing careers in sustainable agriculture, veterinary medicine, and rural health care. Funded through a combination of ranch profits, grants, and private donations, the foundation represented the family's commitment to creating opportunities for others facing the barriers Maria and her children had overcome. 10 years ago, Eleanor addressed the gathered crowd from the porch of the main house, her voice strong with conviction that had replaced the hesitant social awkwardness of her years in isolation. "I found a woman trying to hide her pain in my kitchen." That moment could have ended with a simple medical intervention, ice pack, painkillers, perhaps a reluctant doctor's visit. Instead, it became the beginning of a journey that has transformed not just our lives, but this land and, I hope, this community. She gestured toward Maria, who stood nearby with Miguel and Lucia flanking her like protective sentinels. Maria Diaz Montgomery brought more than her work ethic to this ranch. She brought vision, courage, and an understanding of family that transcended conventional boundaries. The foundation we're launching today honors that vision by extending opportunity to those who, like Maria once was, are rich in potential but limited by circumstance. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause, particularly from the younger attendees who understood personally the significance of such educational support. Miguel, now preparing for his own college applications with dreams of veterinary school firmly established, stood a little straighter, recognizing in this initiative a legacy that would extend beyond his own hard-won opportunities. As the celebration continued into the evening, with tables set up across the ranch yard and local musicians providing entertainment, Eleanor found a quiet moment with Maria near the garden that had been her partner's first independent project. On the ranch, now expanded to nearly an acre of mixed vegetables, herbs, and flowers, the garden had become both a productive part of the ranch operations and a teaching space for visitors interested in organic growing methods. "Did you ever imagine this?" Eleanor asked, gesturing toward the vibrant gathering. "That day when I found you limping in the kitchen? Did you have any sense of what might be possible?" Maria considered the question with the thoughtfulness that characterized her approach to everything. "I imagined survival," she said finally. "Safety for my children. Perhaps, if I was very fortunate, stability." She shook her head slightly, wonder in her expression. "This, a foundation in our names. Miguel preparing for university, Lucia's art hanging in galleries. No, I could not have imagined this." "Nor could I," Eleanor admitted. "I was just trying to do the right thing in that moment, not change the course of all our lives." "That's often how the most important journeys begin, isn't it?" Maria observed. "With a single step taken, not because we can see the destination clearly, but because we know we cannot remain where we are." The wisdom in Maria's words resonated deeply with Eleanor. Her decision to help the limping maid had indeed been that kind of step, not a grand vision of future partnership, but a simple human response to another's pain, a recognition that sometimes healing begins with the smallest gestures of compassion. As summer settled over the ranch, bringing the busy season of educational programs and agricultural tourism, Eleanor found herself increasingly drawn to the writing project she had mentioned to Thomas. Each morning before the day's activities began, she spent an hour at her computer, recording the story of the Montgomery-Diaz partnership from its unlikely beginning to its current flourishing state. The process of documenting their journey forced Eleanor to confront aspects of her own transformation that she hadn't fully articulated even to herself. How Maria's courage in the face of overwhelming obstacles had challenged her own retreat into grief, how the children's resilience had reminded her of life's capacity for renewal, how their unconventional family had healed wounds she had thought would remain open forever. "You've changed my perspective on what makes a successful life," Eleanor wrote in a chapter addressing the partnership's impact on her personal philosophy. "Before you arrived, I measured success by survival, maintaining the ranch, preserving what my husband had built, enduring each day's reminder of what I had lost. You taught me that true success lies in growth, in adaptation, in finding new purpose when old dreams are shattered. The ranch hasn't just survived our partnership. It has evolved into something neither of us could have created alone. The manuscript progressed steadily through the summer months, becoming not just a record of the ranch's transformation, but a meditation on family, resilience, and the courage required to build something new from the ruins of shattered expectations. By the time autumn painted the Montana landscape in gold and crimson, Eleanor had completed a draft that captured the essence of their extraordinary journey. The first person she shared it with was Maria, whose perspective on their shared history provided essential balance to Eleanor's narrative. Together, they refined the manuscript, ensuring that it honored both their individual journeys and the partnership that had transcended cultural differences, legal obstacles, and conventional expectations. There's a publisher in Bozeman who specializes in regional stories and agricultural memoirs, Thomas suggested when they discussed next steps for the project. Sarah Kingsley, she's done some remarkable work elevating voices that might otherwise go unheard. The manuscript, titled The Limping Maid, How an Unexpected Partnership Transformed a Ranch and Healed Two Families, was accepted for publication with enthusiasm. Sarah Kingsley recognized immediately the universal themes beneath the specific circumstances, the human capacity for resilience, the healing power of purposeful work, the potential for connection across differences that might seem insurmountable. This story has implications far beyond Montana ranching, she told Eleanor and Maria during their first meeting. It speaks to our national conversation about immigration, about rural revitalization, about creating family bonds that transcend conventional definitions. I believe it will resonate with readers across the country who are seeking models of community renewal in divided times. The book's publication the following spring coincided with Miguel's acceptance to Montana State University's pre-veterinary program, a convergence of milestones that felt appropriate to the family's intertwined journey. The initial regional interest in the Montgomery Diaz story quickly expanded to national attention when a prominent agricultural journal featured them in a cover story about innovative approaches to rural sustainability. Requests for speaking engagements followed, agricultural conferences, community development symposiums, university lecture series. Eleanor, who had once avoided public appearances of any kind, found herself sharing their story alongside Maria, each woman offering her perspective on the partnership that had transformed not just their own lives, but had become a model for others. Seeking unconventional solutions to complex challenges. The most important lesson we've learned, Eleanor told an audience of agricultural students at Montana State, with Miguel sitting proudly in the front row, is that the boundaries we create between employer and employee, citizen and immigrant, individual families and wider community are often the very barriers that prevent us from finding sustainable solutions. Our partnership worked because we were willing to reimagine those boundaries, to see each other first as human beings with complementary needs and capacities. Maria, whose English had become fluent and confident over the years, added her own perspective. When Eleanor found me limping in her kitchen, I was afraid of losing my job, of exposing my undocumented status, of failing my children. Fear is the enemy of possibility. What allowed our partnership to develop was the courage to move beyond fear toward trust, even when that trust had no guarantees. Their story resonated particularly strongly in rural communities facing similar challenges, declining populations, economic pressures on traditional agricultural models, limited opportunities for young people. The Montgomery Diaz approach to diversification, education, and community integration offered a template that could be adapted to various contexts. A practical vision of rural revitalization built on inclusive partnerships. As the 15-year mark of their unlikely beginning approached, the Double M Ranch had evolved beyond even Eleanor and Maria's ambitious vision. The original cattle operation continued, now managed primarily by Miguel during his university breaks. and a small staff of local ranch hands. The educational programs had expanded to include year-round offerings, from week-long immersive experiences for school groups to specialized retreats for healthcare professionals seeking to understand the therapeutic applications of agricultural work. Lucia, now preparing for college with an impressive portfolio of artistic achievements, had developed a signature style that combined traditional ranch imagery with contemporary social commentary. Her work exploring the intersection of agricultural heritage and immigration experience had been featured in galleries across the Northwest, bringing visual representation to the themes Eleanor and Maria addressed in their speaking engagements. Thomas Walker, having fully retired from medical practice, dedicated his expertise to developing healthcare outreach programs based at the ranch, bringing medical and mental health services to rural communities often underserved by traditional delivery models. His partnership with Eleanor had evolved as organically as the ranch itself. Their marriage 3 years earlier, a natural progression of a relationship built on shared purpose and mutual respect. Benjamin Foster, though technically retired, continued to advocate for immigration reform based on the Montgomery-Diaz model of integration and contribution. His legal strategy had evolved from individual case management to systemic advocacy, using the family story to illustrate the potential benefits of more flexible, humane immigration policies. On a quiet evening 15 years to the day from Maria's arrival at the ranch, the extended family gathered around the dining table that had witnessed so much of their journey together. The meal Maria prepared incorporated elements from both her Mexican heritage and the traditional Montana ranch cuisine Eleanor had grown up with, a culinary representation of their blended family identity. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said as they lingered over dessert, "about what to call this chapter of our story. The first 15 years were about building, creating programs, establishing security, developing our partnership. But now, with Miguel preparing for his professional career, Lucia exploring her artistic voice, the foundation supporting new generations of students, it feels like we're entering a new phase." "Legacy," Thomas suggested, his hand finding Eleanor's under the table in the comfortable gesture that had become habitual between them. Maria nodded thoughtfully. "Not just what we leave behind, but what continues growing after we've planted the seeds." She looked at her children with undisguised pride. "What you two will carry forward in your own ways." Miguel, home from university, and showing increasing confidence in his chosen path, raised his glass in a toast that echoed the one he had offered years earlier, though his voice had deepened and his perspective matured. "To the limping maid and the quiet rancher," he said, "who taught us that family is something you build through choice and commitment, not just something you're born into." Lucia, never to be outdone by her brother, raised her own glass. "And to the power of seeing people as they could be, not just as they are in their moment of greatest vulnerability." As Eleanor looked around the table at these people who had become the heart of her life, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with the simple decision to help a woman in pain. The quiet rancher had indeed left the town speechless with her unconventional choices, but in doing so, she had found her own voice, not just in the book that now carried their story to others seeking models of renewal, but in the daily acts of courage, compassion, and commitment that had transformed a chance encounter into a legacy of healing, purpose, and belonging. The Montgomery-Diaz partnership had rewritten the story of what was possible for a struggling ranch, for an undocumented family, for a grief-stricken widow, for a rural community. And in doing so, they had created a template for others facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. Look beyond conventional boundaries. Recognize the humanity in those society might label as other. Find common purpose and shared needs. Build family wherever genuine connection and commitment align. The quiet rancher who found her limping maid in the kitchen had not only changed the trajectory of both their lives, but had created ripples of possibility that continued to expand outward. touching lives far beyond the boundaries of the double M Ranch. And in that expanding influence lay the true measure of their partnership success, not just in what they had built together, but in what they had inspired others to imagine and create for themselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.